The rain came down in an endless, merciless drizzle, turning the empty streets into rivers of shimmering reflections. Streetlights flickered, their dull glow distorted by puddles that rippled with every drop. The city was asleep, or at least it pretended to be. In the darkest corners, where forgotten souls wandered unseen, the night was never truly quiet. Jack Carter sat beneath the awning of an abandoned storefront, his frayed coat pulled tight around his shoulders. The cold bit into his bones, but it was a familiar ache one he had learned to live with. He leaned against the cracked brick wall, watching as the mist curled along the pavement, twisting like ghosts between the trash bins and empty alleys. It hadn't always been this way. Once, he had a home, a purpose. He had worn a uniform, stood for something greater than himself. But life had a way of breaking even the strongest men, and Jack had learned the hard way that no one was immune to fate's cruel hand. A gust of wind howled through the streets, sending a shiver down his spine. He sighed and tucked his hands under his arms, preparing for another long, sleepless night. Then he heard it, faint but distinct, barely audible over the rhythmic patter of rain against metal and concrete. A whimper. Jack stiffened. His instincts, dulled but never lost, sharpened instantly. He wasn't alone. The sound came again, this time accompanied by the ragged, uneven breathing of something or someone in pain. He turned his head toward the alley to his left, its entrance swallowed by darkness. A feeling settled in his gut, an old, familiar weight, the kind he used to feel before stepping onto a battlefield. He hesitated. Experience had taught him that getting involved in something unexpected rarely ended well. The streets had their own rules, their own dangers, and most people in his position knew better than to go looking for trouble. But something about that sound gnawed at him. Slowly he rose to his feet, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles beneath him. The rain dripped from the edge of his hood as he took a cautious step forward, his breath visible in the cold night air. The alley was a black void, its depths hidden beyond the reach of the nearest street lamp. But Jack didn't need to see. He could feel it. Someone or something was there. A weak, shuddering exhale, a rustle against the damp pavement, then a low, pained whine. Jack's pulse quickened. That wasn't human. It was an animal, and it was hurt. Without another thought, he stepped into the shadows, his heartbeat steady, but his body tense. He had no idea what he was about to find, but something told him this night was about to change everything. Jack moved deeper into the alley, his breath shallow, every step deliberate. The darkness swallowed him whole, the dim glow of the streetlight barely reaching past the entrance. The sound of rain hitting metal dumpsters echoed against the brick walls, masking all but the faintest noises. Then he saw it, a shape curled against the cold, wet pavement. For a moment, Jack thought it was just another pile of discarded trash, something forgotten, abandoned. But as he stepped closer, his pulse quickened. It wasn't garbage. It was a dog, a large one. Its body trembled as it struggled to breathe, sides rising and falling in uneven, shuddering motions. Mud clung to its fur, mixing with something darker, something thick that pooled beneath its body, washing away in crimson ribbons as the rain fell upon it. Blood. Jack's instincts flared. He had seen this before, too many times. The way the body tensed, the way the muscles quivered in pain but remained poised to fight it, was a soldier's wound. A wound that came from violence, not accident. Someone had shot this dog. Jack crouched, careful not to startle it. The animal's ears twitched at the movement, and though it barely had the strength to lift its head, its eyes snapped open. Fierce, sharp, alive. The dog let out a low, warning growl, weak but not defeated. Jack froze, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, his voice steady, calm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's eyes locked onto his, piercing through the darkness, studying him. Even through the haze of pain, its gaze held intelligence, wariness, determination. Jack knew that look. It was the same one he had seen in men who had been left behind, in comrades who had been wounded but refused to give in. He had been one of them, two lost souls discarded by the world. The wound was bad, worse than he had thought. Blood seeped from a gash near its shoulder, a clean entry wound. A bullet. The exit wound was nowhere in sight, which meant one thing. The bullet was still inside. Jack clenched his jaw. If he didn't do something fast, the dog wouldn't make it. His hands moved to his coat, fingers fumbling with the fabric as he tore a strip from the tattered sleeve. He barely felt the cold anymore. Adrenaline drowned out the ache in his bones, the hunger that had gnawed at his stomach for days. Right now, none of it mattered. Gently, carefully, he pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound, applying just enough pressure to slow the bleeding. The dog flinched, but didn't lash out. "Hang in there," Jack muttered, tying the fabric into place. His fingers brushed against something hard beneath the dog's matted fur. A collar. Jack's eyes narrowed. He pushed the blood-soaked fur aside and saw the metal tag glinting under the streetlight. His heart kicked up a beat as he read the engraving. Shadow. And just below it, a police badge. Jack exhaled slowly. So this wasn't just any dog. This was a K9, a trained officer. Someone had tried to kill a police dog. Why? His gut twisted. Something was very wrong. A dog like this didn't just get abandoned in an alley, bleeding out with a bullet in its body. Shadow let out a weak whimper, his body sagging as exhaustion overtook him. The fight was draining out of him, and Jack knew he didn't have much time. He had a choice to make. He could walk away, pretend he never saw any of this. It wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem. He had enough struggles of his own. But as he looked at the wounded dog, as he saw the way Shadow still tried to hold his head high despite the pain, despite the odds, Jack knew he couldn't do that. Because he had been left for dead once too, and no one had come for him. He wouldn't let that happen again. Jack tightened his grip on the soaked bandage, his decision made. He wasn't just going to save this dog. He was going to find out who had tried to kill him. Jack gritted his teeth as he hoisted Shadow into his arms. The dog let out a weak whimper, his body stiffening at the movement, but he didn't fight. He was too tired, too wounded. The rain had turned the alley into a slick mess of mud and grime, and Jack had to move carefully. He staggered under Shadow's weight. He wasn't exactly in peak condition himself. Days without proper food had left him weak, but none of that mattered now. Shadow needed help, and Jack was the only one around to give it. The old warehouse wasn't far. A few blocks away, tucked behind a row of condemned buildings where no one bothered to look. It wasn't much. Just a rusted shell with broken windows and a leaking roof. But it was shelter. And in a world that had long since turned its back on him, it was the only place Jack could call home. As he pushed through the half-collapsed doorway, the smell of damp wood and old oil filled his lungs. The cold crept in from every crack, the wind whistling through shattered panes of glass. But at least it was dry. Jack laid Shadow down on an old pile of rags and cardboard, his hands steady despite the exhaustion settling into his bones. The dog barely moved, only the slow rise and fall of his chest, showing he was still holding on. Kneeling beside him, Jack pulled out the old metal tin he kept stashed under a crate. Inside were the few supplies he had managed to scavenge: some gauze, a half-used bottle of antiseptic, a sewing needle he had once used to stitch up his own wounds. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage, wincing as fresh blood seeped from the wound. The bullet was still in there, lodged deep. That was bad. Infection could set in. Shadow's breathing was labored, each inhale sharp and uneven. Jack worked quickly, pressing an old rag against the wound to slow the bleeding. He poured a small amount of antiseptic onto the gash, and Shadow flinched, a low growl rattling from his throat. "Yeah, I know," Jack muttered, keeping his touch firm but careful. "Hurts like hell, but you gotta stay with me, all right?" Shadow's eyes flickered open, just for a moment, just long enough to meet Jack's. There was something in them, not fear, not anger. Trust, Jack swallowed. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers lying in the dirt, bleeding out, hoping someone would get them home. And just like them, Shadow had been left behind. Jack's jaw tightened as he worked. His hands knew what to do, muscle memory from a life he had left behind. He had patched up worse wounds in the field. He could do this. He had to. But as he wrapped the bandages tight around Shadow's shoulder, something gnawed at him. This wasn't an accident. A stray dog might get hit by a car. A street mutt might get into a fight. But a police canine didn't just end up bleeding in an alley with a bullet in its side. Someone had tried to kill Shadow. Jack sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly as he looked at the dog. The faded police tag on his collar glinted under the dim light. A K9, a trained officer, left for dead. Why? Jack's mind raced. Had Shadow's handler been killed? Was he part of something bigger? If the dog had been shot, that meant someone saw him as a threat. And if they had gone to the trouble of taking him out, they wouldn't want him alive. Which meant whoever had done this probably thought they had finished the job. Jack let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent years trying to keep his head down, stay out of trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. Shadow's breathing had steadied slightly, but his body was still weak, his muscles trembling even in sleep. He wasn't out of the woods yet. Jack knew he should just focus on keeping the dog alive. That should be his only priority. But something about this didn't sit right. He needed answers. The police should be the ones handling this. Shadow belonged to them. But Jack knew better than to walk into a precinct asking questions. A homeless man carrying a wounded canine? They'd think he had stolen the dog. They wouldn't listen. They'd brush him off, maybe even arrest him. And that was assuming the cops could even be trusted. Jack looked down at Shadow again. Someone in the force had abandoned him. Someone had put a bullet in him and left him to die. And Jack had learned a long time ago that the worst monsters didn't always wear masks. Sometimes they wore badges. Jack clenched his fists. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, trying to forget the kind of man he used to be. But tonight something had changed. Tonight he wasn't just a man surviving in the shadows. Tonight he had a reason to fight, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. Jack moved through the streets like a ghost, unnoticed by the city that had long since forgotten him. His worn boots splashed through shallow puddles, the lingering scent of damp concrete and old garbage clinging to the cold night air. He pulled his hood lower, keeping his face in the shadows, blending in with the other souls who called the streets their home. He had spent years learning how to disappear. Tonight, he needed to do the opposite. The alley behind the old shelter was where the others gathered when the weather turned cruel. Fires flickered in rusted barrels, casting long shadows against the crumbling brick walls. Some of the men huddled in stained blankets, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Others murmured in low voices, exchanging scraps of information like currency. Jack approached a cluster of familiar faces, men who, like him, had been chewed up and spit out by the world. 2 nights ago, he said quietly, keeping his voice even, casual. Anything strange happened near the precinct? A few of them shifted uncomfortably. Asking too many questions was a good way to get yourself ignored or worse. But Jack wasn't just another drifter. He had earned a certain level of respect in the unwritten rules of street survival. An older man, bones thin beneath layers of ragged clothing, glanced up from the fire. His name was Carter, though Jack doubted that was his real name. There was a ruckus, Carter muttered, rubbing his hands together over the flames. Cops all over the place. Said someone broke into their house. Jack's stomach tightened. And? They locked the whole damn street down. First, they were looking for a guy. Carter continued, his gaze distant, as if replaying the events in his mind. Then they weren't. Jack frowned. What do you mean? Carter gave a half-hearted shrug. Means first thing, they were running around with descriptions, asking if anyone saw a guy in a black hoodie. But after a while, they weren't looking for no guy anymore. He paused, eyes flicking toward Jack's feet, where Shadow stood silently at his side. They started looking for a dog. A heavy weight settled in Jack's chest. "What kind of dog?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Carter gave a dry chuckle. "Big, black. Looked like the kind they use to chase down guys like us." His gaze lifted. "Looked a lot like yours." Jack exhaled slowly. So Shadow hadn't just been injured, he had been hunted. The question was, why? Shadow shifted beside him, ears flicking as if sensing the tension. Jack absently ran a hand over the dog's head, feeling the rough texture of dried blood clinging to his fur. The wound on his shoulder was still raw, but despite his injuries, Shadow stood strong, muscles coiled, his sharp amber eyes alert. Jack had spent the last 24 hours trying to keep him alive. Now he needed to figure out why someone had wanted him dead in the first place. Jack wasn't a detective, but he knew how to follow a trail, and so did Shadow. Even wounded, the K-9's instincts remained razor-sharp. He moved with purpose, his nose low to the ground, leading Jack through the maze of alleys that crisscrossed the city's underbelly. Jack didn't question it. He had seen enough military dogs work in his time to know when one had found a scent. Shadow was tracking something important. They reached a narrow stretch of pavement behind an abandoned gas station, the kind of place no one had a reason to visit. Shadow stopped abruptly, his ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply. Jack followed his gaze. There, in the dim light of a distant street lamp, was a set of tire tracks, deep grooves etched into the rain-slick pavement. They weren't old. The moisture hadn't yet filled them in completely. Someone had been here recently. Jack crouched beside the tracks, brushing his fingers over the pattern. A van, judging by the spacing. Heavy, probably reinforced. His gut twisted. Shadow let out a soft guttural noise, something between a growl and a whine. His body was tense, his muscles vibrating with the need to move. Jack stood. "You know this, don't you?" The dog didn't hesitate. He started walking. Jack followed. They found it half a mile away, tucked behind an old parking lot filled with rusted cars and forgotten machinery. The vehicle matched the tracks. A dark van, its paint chipped, its windows tinted just enough to hide its contents. It sat at an angle, as if parked in a hurry. Jack approached cautiously, his heart beating steadily in his chest. Something about this felt wrong. Shadow's entire body was rigid, his breathing sharp, focused. His eyes were locked onto the van, the way a predator locks onto its prey. Jack reached for the door handle, locked. He moved to the side window, cupping his hands against the glass to peer inside. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. A stack of manila folders sat on the passenger seat, their edges damp from the humidity. Even in the low light, Jack could see the official markings police files. Stolen evidence. His pulse kicked up a notch. Whatever had happened at the precinct, it wasn't just a break-in. Someone had taken something important, and they had tried to kill Shadow to cover it up. Jack was about to move closer when a sound made him freeze. Footsteps. 2 sets, coming fast. Jack turned just as 2 men rounded the corner of the lot, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of a distant neon sign. The moment they saw him, they stopped dead in their tracks. For a split second, no one moved. Then, without warning, one of them reached for his waistband. Jack didn't wait to see what he was pulling. "Shadow, run!" he hissed, lunging for cover just as the first gunshot shattered the silence. Jack didn't hesitate. The moment the first gunshot rang out, he lunged behind a rusted sedan, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. The scent of oil and rain filled his nostrils as his fingers gripped the cold metal of the car door. The men weren't amateurs. They moved fast, spreading out, trying to cut off his escape. Their boots splashed through puddles, their voices low and urgent as they called to one another. "Find him!" Jack peeked around the edge of the car. One of the men was already circling toward his flank, a gun raised, his eyes scanning the darkness. Another stood near the van, blocking the most obvious way out. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to kill him. Jack exhaled slowly. He had been in worse situations before. Back when he wore a uniform. Back when the enemy was clear, and survival was part of the job. But this was different. He was just a man now. A homeless man with nothing but an injured dog and a past he'd tried to bury. But instincts didn't die. The second man moved closer. Jack could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his finger hovered near the trigger. No more time to think. Jack bolted. He shot out from behind the car, boots pounding against the wet pavement as he sprinted toward the alley. A shout erupted behind him, followed by the crack of another gunshot. The bullet ricocheted off a dumpster, sending sparks flying. Jack didn't stop. He weaved through the maze of back streets, twisting and turning, using every shadow, every darkened doorway to his advantage. But they were closing in fast. A dead end loomed ahead, a crumbling brick wall, too high to scale in the rain. Jack skidded to a halt, spinning on his heel just as the men rounded the corner. They had him. The taller one smirked, lifting his gun, his breath heavy from the chase. Jack's mind raced. No weapons, no cover, no way out. Then from the darkness, a blur of muscle and fur launched through the air. The man barely had time to react before Shadow crashed into him, a snarl ripping through the night. The impact sent them both tumbling to the ground, the gun clattering away as Shadow's jaws locked onto the man's forearm. He screamed, thrashing, trying to shake the K9 loose, but Shadow didn't let go. His growl deepened, his entire body tense with controlled fury. Jack didn't waste the opening. He lunged forward, driving his elbow into the second attacker's gut. The man doubled over with a choked gasp, but Jack didn't stop. He pivoted, grabbing the guy by the collar and slamming him hard into the alley wall. Brick met bone with a sickening crack. The man slumped, dazed but still conscious. Jack turned, ready to help Shadow. But a third figure emerged from the shadows. Jack barely saw the movement before the cold gleam of a gun leveled at his chest. Too fast. No time to react. He braced for the shot. Then in the distance, sirens. The wail of police cruisers shattered the night, red and blue lights flashing against the rain-slick walls. Tires screeched as patrol cars skidded onto the street, blocking the alley's entrance. The third man hesitated, his grip tightening on the gun. Too late. "Drop it!" A voice boomed through a loudspeaker, commanding, unyielding. Dozens of officers poured out, weapons drawn, their shouts cutting through the storm. The man's eyes darted between Jack, the charging officers, and his fallen comrades. His fingers twitched on the trigger. Jack tensed. Shadow growled. For one agonizing second, no one moved. Then the gun clattered to the ground. The man lifted his hands. The fight was over. Shadow finally released his hold, stepping back, his chest rising and falling in heavy pants. His fur was soaked, his injured shoulder trembling from exertion, but his stance remained firm. Jack knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his neck. "You did good, boy," he murmured. Officers swarmed the scene, cuffing the attackers, securing the van, sweeping the area for evidence. A stocky sergeant approached, his gaze flicking from Jack to Shadow, then to the chaos around them. "You want to explain what the hell happened here?" Jack exhaled, glancing down at Shadow. "I think you're gonna want to hear this story," he said, "because this was just the beginning." The flashing red and blue lights painted the alley in an eerie glow, casting sharp shadows over the scene. Rainwater mixed with the dirt and blood on the pavement as officers swarmed the area, securing the last of the criminals. The weight of the night's events still lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. Jack stood off to the side, his muscles still tense, adrenaline not yet willing to leave his veins. Shadow sat beside him, his breathing heavy, but his posture strong. Even wounded, he had refused to back down. Two officers hauled the third attacker to his feet, his wrists secured in cuffs, his face twisted in frustration. Jack watched as they shoved him into the back of a squad car, the man's defiant expression flickering with something else. Fear. They weren't just criminals. They had been caught with something that terrified them more than a lifetime behind bars. Jack turned his attention to the officers now combing through the van, flashlights sweeping over every surface. It didn't take long before a voice called out, "Sergeant, you're going to want to see this." A man in uniform pulled open the rear doors of the van, revealing stacks of stolen police files, manila folders, hard drives, and digital records sealed in plastic bags. A silence settled over the group as the weight of the discovery sank in. This wasn't just a simple robbery. This was evidence proof of something bigger. Jack ran a hand over Shadow's head, his fingers brushing against the worn police tag still hanging from his collar. The dog had been hunted for a reason, and now they were about to find out why. One of the officers, a tall man with streaks of gray in his hair, had been standing quietly near the van, flipping through one of the files. His face suddenly paled. His eyes darted toward Shadow. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "That's Shadow?" Jack stiffened. He turned fully to face the officer, who was now walking toward them, his expression somewhere between disbelief and grief. "I thought he was dead," the man murmured, shaking his head. He crouched slightly, studying the dog like a ghost from his past had just walked into the light. His handler, Officer Hale, was killed during the break-in 2 nights ago. Jack felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't known Shadow's handler personally, but he recognized the look in the officer's eyes, the loss of a partner, not just a fellow officer, but family. The officer exhaled sharply, his gaze shifting to the stolen documents. If these guys had Shadow, it means they were covering something up. He must have seen something, and they couldn't risk him getting out alive. Jack looked down at Shadow, whose golden eyes stared back up at him, unwavering. The pieces clicked together. The men who had killed Officer Hale hadn't just been thieves. They had been inside men. Jack pulled his phone from his pocket. The battery was barely clinging to life, but it didn't matter. He scrolled to his camera roll and hit play. The grainy video from earlier flickered to life. The stolen police files, the van, and more importantly, the men's voices, their conversation, their confession. One of the officers whistled low under his breath. "That's enough to bury them." The sergeant, who had been standing a few feet away, watching in silence, nodded grimly. "And if those files in the van are what I think they are, this goes a hell of a lot deeper than a few stolen documents." Jack felt the air shift. The sun was just beginning to rise when Jack and Shadow finally stepped out of the precinct. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. Jack tucked his hands into his pockets, glancing down at Shadow, who walked beside him, head held high. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't walking alone. He had a purpose. He had a partner. And as they made their way down the empty sidewalk, leaving the darkness behind them, Jack realized something else. For the first time in a long, long time, he had a home.